Well, this is a panel that I've been looking forward to for a long time. New Frontiers in Space Medicine is a title that gives us the flexibility to each year to have a panel or two on what we think are important issues in spaceflight. And we spent a lot of time today looking at low Earth orbit and science and these sort of things. But this panel is specifically directed toward looking at providing medical care for exploration type missions, whether it's lunar or Mars, in transit, surface, that sort of thing. And we have a tremendous panel here today. And Serena Aunon is the moderator, and she's been very instrumental in helping with selecting of the speakers and arranging for this particular panel. She's been introduced today, but I'll mention a few things again. I don't know how anybody does what Serena does and keeps their sanity, because first of all, she's a mother of two in diapers. But she's also the residency program director at UTMB. She's clinical faculty and active on the faculty taking care of sick folks at LSU. And she also is a NASA astronaut, and with Mike, as was mentioned today, with Mike Barrett's mission coming up in February on Axiom, or SpaceX 8. Yeah, 8. She's extremely busy. She's also extremely talented. She got an electrical engineering degree from George Washington University. Interestingly, our residents that come through UTMB, about a third are engineers, and that's actually a really nice skill to have when you're in the space business. She received her medical doctorate from the University of Texas, Houston, and did residency in both internal medicine and aerospace medicine at UTMB. She eventually was in the combined program at transition to do each of the full residency in both, and then also served as the chief resident in internal medicine. She's boarded in aerospace medicine and internal medicine, and she's ideal as a flown astronaut to be able to be moderating this panel. Thank you, Serena.
Thank you, Richard. This is a fun panel every year, as Richard mentioned, and I think you're really going to enjoy this topic, and I hope it invokes a lot of questions from the audience. In fact, I encourage it. So we've got a great lineup. What I'm going to have folks do is do a brief 1 to 2 minute introduction of themselves, and then we'll roll into the first topic. Again, we've talked a lot about LEO today, and we're going to focus more on exploration and some of those challenges. And if y'all don't have questions, I've got some good ones. So, but Dr. Butler, we'll start with you.
All right, under 1 minute. Georgia Tech, drove out in 1971 to go through Navy SEAL training. I was in class with Bill Shepard. And if you want to find a way to make Navy SEAL training more interesting than it already is, just throw Bill Shepard into the mix. Medical school. 5 years of experimental diving research at the Navy Experimental Diving Unit. Eye surgery residency, eye surgery, 15 years running the Navy SEAL biomedical research program, and then the last 3 years of active service, the command surgeon at the Special Operations Command, and then the last 11 years as an Army civil servant running the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Committee. 37 seconds, boom.
Dr. Campbell, thank you.
Yeah, I'm Mark Campbell. I'm a general surgeon in private practice in Paris, Texas. I do a lot of robotic surgery, a lot of laparoscopic surgery. I'm the trauma director at the institution. 30 years ago, I was a flight surgeon at NASA and deployed to Russia for the Shuttle Mir project. And I did a lot of parabolic flight research on how to perform a surgical procedure in weightlessness.
And Dr. Kurtzman, who for the Rams, Eric and I were co-Rams together in the program many years ago.
Yeah, Serena and I went through the UTMB Aerospace Medicine Residency Program together. One of the residents Richard talked about, that's an engineer before I went to medical school, mechanical engineering, bachelor's degree. I was in practice for 10 years before I went through the Aerospace Medicine Residency. My primary specialties before aerospace medicine were physical medicine and rehabilitation and pain medicine. So I'm board certified in 3 specialties, those PM&R, pain medicine, and aerospace medicine. I've been with NASA since I left the program and graduated from the program in 2007. I primarily worked on medical research support under the Human Research Program, but also done some musculoskeletal rehab medicine for NASA. And I'm currently still working at NASA doing mostly work on future medical systems for exploration missions.
Thank you, Eric. Dr. Schmidt.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm a NASA flight surgeon, operational flight surgeon. I was trained by Dr. Jennings and Dr. Smith-Johnson, and in 2004, I became the co-director for the residents when they would come up. I trained with several of these folks who are now NASA flight docs. I did shuttle first and then station, Soyuz missions, and now the lead for medical operations for the Orion vehicle. I most recently finished an ISS mission where we had Frank Rubio go for more than 1 year. That was our mission. Previously, I was in the Air Force at 33 years there. My last job was working at the Pentagon, where we were designing the medical care for the Space Force itself. And I'm looking forward to talking about delayed communication today.
Fantastic. Dr. Marshburn.
Yeah, Tom Marshburn, physics major, went into engineering, fell in love with medicine, so did emergency medicine, then entered the very first class of the UTMB at the time, fellowship, and then left and became a colleague at Dr. Johnson's as a NASA flight surgeon, also trained under Dr. Jennings. Got into the Astronaut Corps in year 2004 flew 3 missions, short duration shuttle, and then 1 long on the ISS via the Soyuz, and then 1 long via the Dragon. Retired from that in the end of last year, and now I'm Chief Medical Officer for Sierra Space.
And finally, Dr. Blue.
I'm Becky. I'm one of the flight docs. Also UTMB trained under Dr. Jennings. I primary specialty was emergency medicine, so did that first during emergency medicine residency. Additionally got fortunate enough to accidentally stumble into the launch and landing medical support team, so I did launch and landing medical support for the last 9 shuttle missions. Then picked up by the residency, did the residency for a couple of years. At graduation, went to work for Virgin Galactic, was Virgin Galactic's flight surgeon, first flight surgeon, worked for them for about 4 years. Left, came back to NASA. At NASA, I've been engaged in most of the divisions, including research, exploration, and since before Demo 2 started working for CCP, my current job is CCP SpaceX MedOps lead. So I work the Dragon missions, and I'm in HLS development, working with the commercial providers on development of landing systems. And I have the great privilege of having the opportunity to additionally work with the residents, particularly in medical operations research.
Fantastic. So if you've ever seen the movie Spies Like Us, these are your doctors down the table. Doctor, thank you. So we'll start with you, Dr. Butler, about looking at external hemorrhage control.
So I acknowledge that it's a little strange having an ophthalmologist talk to you about external hemorrhage control. Obviously, that was something that came as part of the Navy SEAL medical research director job that I had. And since there are physicians in this audience, I hope that most people here know about the tremendous success that the U.S. military had with tourniquets in Iraq and Afghanistan. So what you may not know is that was very much not the case in Vietnam, where we had an estimated 3,400 service members bleed to death from arm or leg wounds. More than Pearl Harbor, more than the Twin Towers. So what did the U.S. military do after Vietnam to fix this? Not much. If you fast forward to 1992, which is when the research program got involved with this, we were still teaching corpsmen and medics not to put on tourniquets. I don't know if any of you are ATLS instructors. So I was an ATLS instructor. I was there. I was teaching the medics and the corpsmen not to put on tourniquets. It's what everybody believed, the military and the civilians. So in this time frame, I had to have my knee operated on. And so I show up in the OR, and I'm getting ready to go to sleep, and the last thing I remember before I went to sleep was that the orthopedic surgeon put a tourniquet on my leg. And I started to say something about that, just then the propofol kicked in. But I did bring it up with him afterwards. I said, you know, Jeff, we teach corpsmen and medics not to put on tourniquets. And you put a tourniquet on my leg for an hour. He said, Frank, what can I tell you? We do it every day. We do it all the time. It's not a problem. So, wow, that's a disconnect. You know, we teach corpsmen and medics not to use these devices, and yet the orthopedic surgeons use them every day. Time to go back and rethink tourniquets. And it turns out a number of other things about battlefield trauma care too. So we spent 4 years doing that. The Tactical Combat Casualty Care paper was published in 1996. And for the next 5 years, that's about all the TC3 program was. You know, just a paper that was published. It was presented at conferences. I went around to medical units and presented it to some specific special ops units. There were some early adopters, the Navy SEALs, the Army Rangers, Delta, and the PJs. But for the most part, it was ignored by the military and the civilians. And then what happened in 2001? Yeah, we went to war. And the military units that didn't have tourniquets with them, what happened to their guys and gals who were shot in the arm or leg? They bled to death. So I got to Tampa as their new command surgeon in 2004 and asked my staff, I said, you know, help me out here. How many people have we had killed in Afghanistan and Iraq? What did they die of? And what could we have done to prevent their deaths? Nobody knew. We just weren't doing that kind of research at the time. So we did that kind of research. We got the Army Institute of Surgical Research. Dr. John Holcomb, who some of you may know, he was a surgeon here in Houston, did tremendous work. We had lost people to a lack of tourniquet use. Terrible to lose anybody, but really terrible if their death could have been prevented. So I went to the general and pitched this to him. Came away with $7 million and spent it on tourniquets and hemostatic dressings and a training team to go and get our guys ready to go to the war. And throughout the next 6 or 7 years, it caught on in the rest of the U.S. military. At the end of the war, by all measures, tourniquets were immensely successful. A conservative estimate of the lives saved is about 2,000. They were safe. The reason that we hadn't let people use tourniquets before in the military was because we were afraid of tourniquet ischemia, that the arm or leg would be damaged because it didn't get any blood and would have to be amputated when they got back to the surgical facility. Total number of times that happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, exactly 0. So, they have now begun to catch on in the civilian world. The American College of Surgeons, under the leadership of Dr. Linworth Jacobs, one of the regents of the American College, he put together, after the Sandy Hook shootings, an effort to get civilians using these as well. So civilians didn't use tourniquets until about 2013, and now they do. Maybe about 25% of the EMS systems. But fast forward now to at 2 years into the Ukraine war. The tourniquets have done really well up until now. All of a sudden, they're not doing well. And the reason is because in Afghanistan and Iraq, evacuation would take 1 to 2 hours. In Ukraine, it takes 2 to 3 days sometimes. And if the tourniquet is on your leg for 2 to 3 days, that leg is gone. And so when I leave here, I'm headed for Ukraine. And we are going to try, there's a joint team between the U.S. military and the U.S. Department of State. We're going to try to go through and rethink how to use tourniquets and not lose extremities. So we're going to meet in Warsaw in Poland, and here is what's going to be presented to them. And you are the first group to have ever heard this, because this has been my project for the last couple of months. The first element is that we need to better train medics to know what life-threatening bleeding looks like. You know, if you get shot in the leg and it's not bleeding, you don't need a tourniquet. And yet, a lot of people are getting tourniquets when they don't really need them because we haven't done a good enough job teaching them what wounds should have tourniquets. The second thing is to continue. We've taught people to be aggressive about applying tourniquets when the battle is still going on. If we're getting shot at, I'm not going to spend a lot of time putting the tourniquet on Serena's leg. It's going on quick, and then I'm going to get back to what I was doing. And we don't want to change that. But we do want them not to automatically put the tourniquets on as they say high and tight. This is something that our medics advocated for. In the middle of a gunfight, you may not have really a chance to stop and take off the uniform and examine the leg. So in some situations, you may just want to cover the entire extremity and put it on in the upper thigh or the upper bicep. That's great, but you don't need to do that all the time. If you've got a gunshot wound to the foot, don't put the tourniquet on the upper thigh, and believe me, that's happening. It's happening right now a lot in Ukraine. In fact, a number of papers, both out of Ukraine and out of the U.S. civilian sector, have shown that tourniquets are being used safely and successfully, but they're being used improperly. And by improperly, I mean that most tourniquet applications were not really needed. So the next thing is to reassess the need for that tourniquet as soon as you can. At some point, the shooting is going to stop. And then take a second, you stop, you release the tourniquet, you see if the wound is bleeding. If blood is pulsing out, then you put the tourniquet right back on. If it's not, then you may be able to just remove it. If it still needs a tourniquet, but it's placed up high and the wound is down more distal on the limb, then you take the tourniquet and move it 2 to 3 inches proximal to where the bleeding is. And we teach that now, but it just needs to be reinforced for the Ukrainians. The next element is that we need to teach the medics to be more aggressive about converting these tourniquets. And when I say converting the tourniquets, at some point you're going to be able to release the tourniquet and take a hemostatic dressing and pack it into the wound and then put pressure over it, and you'll be able to control the bleeding from the injured vessel without cutting off the blood supply to the entire limb. And we've been teaching that, but we haven't been emphasizing it enough. I will say that it's great that the tool paper indicates that NASA's all over tourniquets and hemorrhage control, and I think that's fantastic. If they're going to be doing this on the moon or on Mars, they also have to be all over converting those tourniquets as soon as they can, or the astronaut's going to lose a limb when she or he didn't have to. The military has chosen combat gauze as their hemostatic agent of choice. It's good. Cost about $35. If I were buying one for somebody that I loved or somebody that was on my mission, I would buy these. This is the Everest dressing. They're a little pricey at $500 each, but these things work like nobody's business. This is fibrinogen and thrombin in a cellulose matrix. As soon as it's hydrated, what does that turn into? A fibrin clot. And the last paper that I read before I came down here was this incredible case report about a person who was shot in the heart. And amazingly, they managed to keep him alive to the emergency department, where he had 2 holes in his heart at those 2 locations. They exposed the heart and put this Everest dressing on those 2 holes, held pressure for 10 minutes, and the holes were plugged. They did not have to go back and suture. They didn't have to try to staple. The holes were plugged. So that's a case report like no other. So, and then the last thing is you have to frequently reassess as you move the casualty, as you resuscitate the casualty with blood products. A wound that has stopped bleeding may start bleeding again, or vice versa. So it's got to be a dynamic process where you're looking at your patient all the time and trying to keep that tourniquet off. So, how'd I do, boss?
That was, I have tons of questions I'm going to hold because it really has already made me think about what we carry even just in the ISS medical kit, let alone Artemis and other places. So what I'm going to do is I am going to ask the audience if they have any questions to start, and then, yeah. Do we have a microphone we're going to move around? Or thank you, Richard.
I can speak up as well.
It's for the interpreters and for online. Yeah. Thank you, Richard.
I just want to ask really quickly. So, how did they manage to keep pressure on a beating heart like that?
Send me an email and I'll send you a copy of the paper. I mean, just direct pressure with the bandage in there. And it was a fibrin bandage.
We got Bill over here. Bill Shepard.
Frank, I've heard anecdotally that there's a device that kind of lives in a tube when people have internal injuries, and you stick, it's kind of like a roll of toilet paper, the cardboard thing, and you jam it into the wound, and it does the same thing about coagulating the blood. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, that's called rescue foam. And it basically is, there are two precursors that are injected separately. When they get into the abdominal cavity, they coagulate and make a big, like plaster cast inside your abdomen and apply pressure inside the abdominal cavity and usually stop the bleeding. It's been tested extensively. It's been funded by DARPA, so it's been tested extensively in animal models. But right now, it's not yet approved by the FDA. The clinical trials are ongoing, including here in Houston. So if there's an occasion for somebody to need it here, this is one of the areas where they would be able to get it under a research protocol, but we can't give that to corpsmen and medics yet because it's not FDA approved.
Say I'm putting together a medical kit to go out in the desert to do launch and landing ops for Rumus Aglumus Space Company, and I'm sure that'll translate well. Are there any of the tourniquets that you think we ought to buy that are way above the others or better than the other tourniquets?
I would send you a paper that has a really good evaluation of all of the devices out there. I hesitate to mention one or two, but I'll mention the combat application tourniquet and the soft T-wide tourniquet only because those are the ones that we've used for the past 15 years. There are some new devices that are probably also very good, but they're less tested.
Any other questions? I'm sure there'll be more. We'll have plenty of time also at the end of the panel. But thank you, Dr. Butler. That was fantastic. Dr. Campbell.
Yeah. Well, my remarks are going to be very operationally based. My concept of how you would provide surgical care on a Mars expedition resembles how surgical care was delivered in the United States actually in the 1960s. We had a lot of general practitioners who were trained in a variety of areas. They delivered babies, they did everything. They also had some surgical training and they did surgery. And if you had a hernia repair done in the 60s, it was probably done by a general practitioner, not by a board-certified general surgeon. We had a symposium about 15 years ago, and we had 20 leaders in academic surgery, people who teach other people how to do surgery. And they met and came up with a list of surgical capabilities for a Mars expedition and what we would need to do to train a CMO to fulfill all those capabilities. Unfortunately, the results of that were never written up. Dr. Norm McSwain passed away about a year after that and wasn't able to complete the project. But the consensus was that if you took an MD crew medical officer and had 2 to 3 months of focused training, he could be trained to do everything that was on the surgical capability list. And these were things like putting in a chest tube, closing a large wound, doing an open appendectomy, and even somewhat of a stretch, even maybe doing an exploratory laparotomy. But I think it was very realistic, and the academic leaders that met had no connection to space medicine, really. They were just, they weren't biased in any way. It would be, I think, hard for me to see a place in a system like that for laparoscopy or robotic surgery. Those procedures take a large amount of equipment that's very high in weight and volume and relatively unreliable. They do break down, and ISS has taught us that everything will break down. And also, the laparoscopy and robotic surgery is geared for very, very specific operations. Hysterectomy, appendectomy, hernia repair, cholecystectomy. It's not applicable to the rest of the general surgery capabilities, which are broad and vast, that we have to be capable of doing. And then finally, to use that technology requires a lot of experience and a lot of training. And so we just aren't going to have that. But things like ultrasound-directed percutaneous drainage is very much what we want to train them to do, because a lot of diseases can be treated that way. Just going specifically to the treatment of traumatic hemorrhage, I just kind of have a list of what I would like to do operationally, what I'd like to be capable of to take care of trauma. And one real simple thing is to be able to put in a chest tube. 90% of intrathoracic trauma can be taken care of by just putting in a chest tube, re-expanding the lung, and tamponading off the bleeding. And that's a capability we don't have on the ISS. I would like to be able to do a surgical procedure in an efficient manner, and for that I need a surgical procedure kit that has all the instruments and supplies already in it, and you put it on a wall and deploy it as a sterile field. It organizes all your instruments and restrains them. And if you do that, you can pretty much perform a surgical procedure in weightlessness that doesn't look that much different than a surgical procedure in 1G. And so again, that's not a capability we have on the ISS. All of our surgical instruments are sterile in an individual package, and so it's not conducive to performing an actual procedure. Abdominal, intra-abdominal traumatic hemorrhage is mostly nowadays treated non-operatively. We take hepatic and splenic and renal lacerations. We treat the majority of those non-operatively. But we have very good imaging with CT scanning, so we can diagnose those injuries and pretty much predict if they're going to make it through non-operative treatment or not. And then also, if it fails non-operative treatment, we can always take them to surgery. But still, that is something that I think we could be capable of. I would like a pelvic binder. That's a real simple thing, but is absolutely life-saving. And it's just a small binder that you put around the pelvis. And if you have a pelvic fracture, and you can tighten it up very, very tight, and it closes that pelvic fracture down and greatly decreases the hemorrhage. 2 weeks ago, we had a pelvic fracture that lost 16 units of blood. I mean, you can lose a lot of blood with a pelvic fracture. This pelvic binder could also be made adaptable so that it could act as a tourniquet. It could also act as an occlusive bandage on top of an extremity injury. And then I'd want to be able to put on a universal external fixation device for an extremity fracture. That sounds complicated, but actually doesn't require a whole lot of equipment, and it is very trainable. The first external fixator that I put on, I was a medical student with a lot of supervision, but it's very easy to train for, and you can reduce an extremity fracture. Of course, that takes away the pain and it takes away the hemorrhage. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is be aware of the danger of medical evacuation back to Earth. And I think you alluded to this in your talk. But if you we classify traumatic hemorrhage into different classes, 1, 2, 3, and 4. A class 1, which is the smallest, you're removing 500 to 750 cc's of blood, and they're tachycardic, but it doesn't affect their blood pressure. That's a class 1 hemorrhage. If you think about it, that's what happens when you undergo an LBNP protocol. It's very similar to a class 1 hemorrhage. And we know from the LBNP studies that your tolerance of LBNP protocols is not as good when you're in 1 week with a shuttle as it is you're out to 2 or 3 months. You can't tolerate those LBNP protocols as well. And so class 1 hemorrhage, they're not going to be able to tolerate. A deconditioned astronaut's not going to be able to tolerate very well at all, or not as well as you would expect. They have cardiac deconditioning, they've had plasma volume loss, they have loss of their baroreceptor responses, and so they're not going to respond in a normal way. They are definitely deconditioned. And then on top of that, if you go through a reentry profile, and hopefully it'd be a 2 or 3G reentry and not a 8G reentry, but you put that on top of that. So you have a triple whammy, a class 1 hemorrhage, a deconditioned astronaut, and then a high G or relatively high G reentry profile. I think you can expect on landing that they're not going to look very good physiologically, and you're going to be prepared to really aggressively resuscitate them, and also to try to over-resuscitate them before you medically evacuate them. I really like talking to Frank Butler because a lot of things have changed in trauma due to the Afghanistan war, especially the way we resuscitate trauma. Back in the 1960s, Tom Shires at Southwestern Medical School developed crystalloid resuscitation for trauma. And ever since then, you give 2 liters of crystalloid to a trauma patient coming in. And we're getting away from that very rapidly now, because it's found that crystalloid, and Smith alluded to this, it damages the endothelium membrane of the arteries, and it causes a lot of release of inflammatory proteins. And the difference between people who are resuscitated with crystalloid and not resuscitated with crystalloid is the crystalloid resuscitation, they get ARDS and post-traumatic ARDS. So we're staying away from crystalloid resuscitation now. We're going to very early, very aggressive blood product transfusion. We're using massive transfusion protocols, and we're giving, and this is all because of Afghanistan. This is all because of Afghanistan. It's what we've learned. You've got to give blood products very early and give a lot of them. And also, we used to give plasma at a 2-to-1 ratio. After Afghanistan, it's now 1-to-1. And the benefits of fresh frozen plasma are huge. It's great for the resuscitation of shock, and it has 3,000 proteins in it, and a lot of them we don't know what they do. It has all your clotting factors, it has immune factors, it has factors that prevent inflammatory responses like ARDS, and it has factors that prevent thrombolysis. So a really exciting thing that's coming out is freeze-dried plasma. We use freeze-dried plasma a lot in World War II. It's still being used in Europe, but it hasn't been used until recently in the United States. It's going to come back really, really, really quick. And basically, you can sit on the shelf for 2 years. You take it down, you reconstitute it with saline, you can give it right away, and it has all the benefits of fresh frozen plasma. There are several groups that are working on freeze-dried packed red blood cells, and I still think that clinically available is a long ways off. This is embryonic research, but I feel fairly confident that they'll get that done. And so you'll have packed cells that you can sit on the shelf for 2 years and take down and reconstitute. And the thing I'm also interested in is walking donors. In Afghanistan, we gave 10,000 units of blood that we took from a well soldier and gave to a traumatic soldier. And there's talk about special forces, 10-member units using walking donors as well. And the special forces squad members have the equipment to do that. It doesn't take a lot of equipment, and I don't think it takes a lot of training either. It's very easy to train for. and they're able to get a unit of blood from one of their squad members and give it to someone who's injured. And I think that's a very good analysis for what we'll need to do. The donation on this follows all the other rules of donation. You don't really need to be worried about type and cross. These are not patients that have had a long exposure to multiple blood products, but it should be type specific. But we give a lot of O-negative blood. We give tons of O-negative blood. So O-negative blood is the universal donor. So if you want to do a medical selection criteria for Mars, I don't care if you've had a prophylactic appendectomy. I want you to have O-negative blood.
I'm in. Let's go.
Few of the things I just wanted to comment on. Do I have enough time?
Yeah, absolutely.
First of all, 3D printing, I think that's going to be a great thing. It's not there yet. The products I've seen are made out of very soft material and very low resolution, but it will get better. They'll have higher resolution, and I'm sure they'll have materials that are more conducive to surgical instruments. So I think that's a great thing. I get asked a lot about, well, what if you use a surgical instrument, and then how do you sterilize it in space? I don't think you need to sterilize instruments. I think you need to have clean instruments. There are reports coming out now of using clean and not sterile instruments for minor surgical procedures in offices. It appears to not have any increase in infection rate. And my gut feeling is there would be no increase in infection rate using clean instruments as compared to sterile. I think we need more data on that to be able to confidently promote it, and hopefully people who are interested in doing some research will figure out a way to get through the IRB to do that. Prophylactic surgery, people talk about having a prophylactic appendectomy. I think that's a very bad strategy because you're taking a very specific disease that has a relatively low incidence, has a very low incidence in astronauts, and you're trying to mitigate the risk on that one disease. It doesn't help you to be able to, you have to be capable of doing all the other things that you have to do with the other 200 or so surgical events. So I don't think it's a very good strategy. And then I have really a question for our people working on Artemis, and that is, I think it's a given that when you go from ISS to lunar surface, you're going to lose a lot of medical equipment. You just can't put that medical equipment up there. There's just too much volume and weight. And yet you go from a definitive medical care time of 24 hours to 4 days. And so I'm just throwing my question out early. I'd like to know how y'all are going to try to mitigate that. I know y'all have a plan. I'd just like to hear what it is. I guess I'm sort of loading the question. I think everybody ought to understand right up front there's increased risk, and we won't be able to do anything about it.
Agreed.
To some extent.
Yeah, literally, right now you can come home in 45 minutes if you don't care where you're going to splash down.
Yeah.
And, you know, usually you want to plan more than that.
Yeah.
And 3.5 hours or more. And then do you want to bring a person back down, you know, under high Gs, and then in a car crash. And now you multiply that with coming back from the moon, where you have to potentially rendezvous with your gateway, and then rendezvous with the Orion, and then commit, do a skip atmosphere, and maybe have a Navy ship somewhere near where you can splash down. So
there was
are a lot of
a
challenges.
research study done 50 years ago that will never be repeated. They hemorrhaged primates and centrifuged them, and if you had a class 1 or class 2 hemorrhage, you did okay. But if you had more like a class 3 hemorrhage, or if you had a high G return, like a 6G return instead of a 2.5, they didn't do very well. Okay, that's all I have.
No, fantastic. I can't wait till we get to the end here. That's so I'm going to keep moving, and we're going to go next to Dr. Kurtzman and predictive models.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I think that's a great lead-in. The question you had, Mark, for what I'm going to talk about. So the past about 15 years, I've been working on developing predictive models for medical events in spaceflight. And going back to about 2006, somebody had the idea to develop a probabilistic, evidence-based model to help predict medical events and how we treat them and what the outcomes would be on these space missions. So the first model that was developed, which is still used by NASA, it's called IMM, the Integrated Medical Model. But that model is actually being phased out, and the next generation that's being developed by XMC and that will actually transition to operations under space medicine is called IMPACT. and it's really the next generation of IMM. So I just want to talk a little bit briefly about IMM and then go into a little bit about what the next generation model is going to do that IMM doesn't. So the concept behind IMM was, is it possible to build a computer simulation model that could predict what medical events would occur on specific spaceflight missions, and to optimize what resources, medical resources particularly, you'd want to fly in that mission to decrease mission risk and overall mission risk. And like some of the devices you mentioned now, the question is, do you want to take those devices? Do they buy down enough risk? Can you afford the mass and volume? And it's really a trade space question, because for everything you fly, you might have to leave something else off. So it's a very complex question, and that's why we sort of turn to modeling to help answer the question. So we don't use these models like IMM to answer the question directly, but we use it to inform the decision makers, because they are models, they're not perfect, and they do give range of answers with some uncertainty around it. What IMPACT does that IMM doesn't do, so IMM was baseline to the International Space Station. And that was for a reason, because we wanted a proof of concept that it would work for ISS. We've used it for ISS, meaning that the ISS program has their own PRA model where they look at non-medical risks, and they wanted a medical risk component to use as part of their model. And ISS program has been using the IMM for about the past 10 years to help inform the medical risk. It turns out that the medical risk from ISS is the biggest risk. You're more likely to have to evacuate the station, not from a micrometeorite or a suit failure, but from a medical event still. And the ISS actually didn't know that until they sort of worked with IMM and were able to believe that that was the case. And we've had we haven't had to bring anyone home from ISS, thankfully, but we've probably had some considerations where we've considered it. Now, for future exploration missions, it's going to be more complicated than that, because we won't have the easeability to bring somebody home as quickly as we will from ISS. So it's even more important that your medical system is able to handle the varied types of medical issues that you might face, and that the crew can handle these and do them more independently. So what IMPACT is doing that IMM can't, or that IMPACT will do, because it's about to transition to operations in 2024, it's going to account for the partial gravity environment of lunar missions, Mars missions. It'll account for different mission segments, meaning not only being in microgravity, but taking a subset of the medical system down to the lunar surface, so you don't have the whole medical system. What's the probability that you'd have to go back from the lunar surface back to Gateway, where you might have more medical capability, and you will want to avoid that worst case scenario of having to bring somebody home, or worse, having somebody die in space from a medical event that you could have treated. So the idea of the modeling, and particularly with IMPACT, will be to have a model that can help inform these decisions for future exploration missions, so that the people that are going to make the decisions, what will you fly in that mission, what medical capabilities, what kind of training will you give the crew, will you be able to do surgery in space, or should you be able to or not, for which missions, we can make better decisions in answering those questions by having some quantitative approach to do that. Now, IMM, which, like I said, will be phased out, it has been used by ISS to inform decisions. It's been used to help, in some cases, with crew certification issues where certain crew members might have pre-existing conditions and you want to get some assessment of their risk. So I think IMPACT will be used in a similar way. But beyond that, it can also be used for research to say what medical devices should we invest money in that are the most important, that will buy down risk. The thing about the medical risk is we have to remember it's not the only risk in space. There's a lot of non-medical risks. If you fly a very, very large, robust medical system, you will be, although you might reduce the medical risk, you still have some residual medical risk no matter how much you fly or how well trained the crew is. But you might inadvertently increase your non-medical risk by taking away from, let's say, redundant systems, that you need for the engineering side. So it's a balance. So the idea is not really necessarily to get to the lowest absolute medical risk. It's to get to the lowest total mission risk. And that's where the modeling can really help, because these questions are actually really too complicated for any person to answer, one single flight surgeon or one mission planner, without having these type of tools to help inform it. So I'm just going to leave it there with the medical modeling. If I have a few extra minutes, I can either get to take some questions.
That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to break and let's take some
Okay.
questions before we move on to the half. So, we got a question up here. Do we have a microphone, actually? Oh, thanks. Sorry, Richard. I feel bad.
Talking about both current and future predictive models, what types of crew member attributes are input parameters into that predictive model?
Yeah, great question. So for the current model we're using, the IMM, we actually try to mimic the current astronaut crew population. So when we do research on the incidence for the conditions that we have in the model, we try to find, we use analog populations if we can. So we'll take, let's say, military populations or exploratory conditions like, let's say, Antarctic missions, and try to see if we have data from that. So we try to take a healthy population, and we sort of know the average age of astronauts. We know the male-female ratio. We know what medical standards we have right now, so what medical conditions they will not be flying with, what their cardiac risks are to some degree. So we try to model the typical astronaut core. It's not exact. It's like looking at a population health, because the astronauts, although we try to make them medically the same, that's the whole point of like a crew certification, they are different. Not everyone has the same risk. So we try to do like we call like an average astronaut cadre that we'll put into the model. But we could modify that. And we've done that in the past when looking at specific astronauts that have, let's say, certain pre-existing medical conditions or higher risk factors for cardiac disease or something else.
And Eric, I would add that half of those conditions that are in that modeling space came from about half of the conditions came from actual spaceflight data.
That's right.
So it's marked by actual data on health events that have occurred in spaceflight as well.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, that's good. That's a good point. And and we've validated the model to some degree on other spaceflight missions that we've flown, where we haven't used that data in the model. So we're able to know that we can predict to some reasonable level of accuracy on what medical events have occurred. About half the conditions have occurred in flight, and about half have not occurred, but we know could occur. Things like bone fractures have not occurred, but they're in the model. I hope that helps answer your question.
I had a quick question to just, you had mentioned something as far as like staging, say for an evacuation situation, and I hadn't had the thought before, but if you had a low Earth orbit station in addition to all those other things like gateway and so forth, where you could temporize somebody even further for that re-entry, is that also a scenario that's been considered, whether that's using that as a place that has a little bit more medical resources, can do a transfusion or do something like that to best like tease somebody up before re-entry?
It's difficult because you're having to come back to Earth, and then you may not be on the same inclination. And then, of course, the speed is so much, 33,000 miles an hour, I think, and you'd have to do it right to be able to enter and recover there. But never say never.
I have a question. So everybody's talking about we can't take anything at all, hardly, to Mars because of the mass constraints. And I understand that with the crew vehicle, because you need to get the crew there in like 6 months, let's say, for radiation. And but due to the rocket equation, to get there quick, the mass you can take is very little. But you don't necessarily, with cargo, have to get there fast. And when you put a vehicle in space and it's already going 17,500 miles an hour, then you refuel it in space, and then you take longer to get there, where you don't have to have the delta V to carry a large cargo. Has anyone looked at the scenarios where if you had the optimum and you could have what you want on Mars and send it there as cargo before the crew even gets there, what you would want for your medical system?
So you're talking about pre-deployment of resources, essentially?
Yeah.
That would be, the beautiful thing about the modeling, you can do that. So instead of putting the constraints of what's going in the crew capsule, you can expand that to say what's been pre-deployed. And of course, some things, like something I'm thinking of that you may or may not want to pre-deploy. Medical equipment could probably be pre-deployed, but maybe not pharmaceuticals, depending, because of life, limitations on pharmaceuticals. So you could figure out what you should pre-deploy and what you should not, and you could theoretically buy down your risk even further.
I don't know if it's still true, but I used to hear that it was $10,000 a pound to low Earth orbit, $100,000 a pound to lunar surface, and $1 million a pound to Mars surface. Is that about right?
It's changing, but I'm actually going to push on that a little bit and play a little devil's advocate here, right? Which pre-deployment of resources sounds like a really great fix, but let's talk about why that's a problem, right? And there's a couple of ways that it's a problem. Either you pre-deploy and you confirm, so one of the goals might be to confirm that those resources got there before you launch the human, right? The problem is, whatever you've pre-deployed, so say we're going to Mars, right? And you've pre-deployed something and now it's sitting on the lunar surface. Do you think it's sitting there pressurized? It's not sitting there pressurized. We don't launch and pre-deploy pressurized vehicles. So whatever goes there has to be able to survive vacuum and exceptional extremes of temperature, right? Which limits what we can pre-deploy. We mentioned not so much pharmaceuticals, that's a problem, right? But it limits a lot of the other equipment, right? How much of that surgical suite is likely to fracture when put at freezing cold temperatures, right? Things don't work so great when they go to vacuum and then come back from vacuum once you get a pressurized vehicle up there to work with them. Alternatively, we could try and fly them to arrive right on time with the human, and therefore they're not pre-deployed, they're not hanging out there far in advance. And the challenge with that is now you got to assume both vehicles make it. And there's a decent chance it doesn't. And now you've just launched a crew with no medical equipment because you didn't make sure it was there to begin with. If you do launch it way ahead of time, we're talking years, right? What's the likelihood that stuff survives? What's the likelihood it's the same technology you want 6 years later when you launch your crew, or 3 years later when that crew lands, right? There's a lot of factors here, a lot of real challenges in pre-deployment or pre-staging of equipment that's really hard to overcome. One of the many reasons we fly the medical kit with the crew is that, number one, it's in the environment of the crew. Do you guys know what the temperature limits of your pharmaceuticals are? Oh, those in the crowd who live in Houston and leave your ibuprofen in your car on a nice summer day. Yeah, 80 degrees, 78 actually. You're not supposed to allow your pharmaceuticals to get any hotter than that as we pop our Tylenol from our car trunks, right? You're not supposed to. We certainly don't test to those conditions, right? So allowing them to be in vehicle with crew means that they're in the environment that the crew is in. It also allows them to be used when the crew needs them. Worst case scenario, it takes a year and a half, 2 years to get to Mars. If you've pre-launched all your equipment, it'll be there when you get there. But what happens when you need it 3 months into your mission, right? So your equipment does, to at least some degree, need to be with you. There are a lot of limitations to pre-planting some of those items on a surface before you can get there. And these are things that we haven't really overcome, at least as long as it takes us a long time to keep getting there, right?
And hopefully I didn't answer flippantly the question or the answer you were thinking about, how to rendezvous with some other assets. Buzz Aldrin, I was talking about a circulator that would go between here and the moon continuously, so you might be able to rendezvous with that. There may be a series of circulating vehicles that might be going between here and Mars and rendezvous with one of those. So those crazy ideas, keep coming up with them.
But to pile on to the flippancy of a quick answer, I'll be flippant in mine. You mentioned we might want to pit stop for a transfusion. What's the shelf life of blood products? Mm-hmm. Do you know?
Good answer, Mike. Good answer.
What's the shelf life of an unrefrigerated blood product? Do you want 16-hour blood pumped into you? No? Okay.
Yeah, so the question I'll pose later, because I had no idea, going back to Dr. Butler, first I never thought about conversion of the tourniquet. I never thought about that. And so, after you figure out that sort of conversion, and let's say the person does need some sort of blood product, I'd never thought about the freeze-dried aspect. And is that our only option for something on the Martian surface or lunar surface? I don't know. Never thought about it.
Well, you can store the blood quite conveniently in your fellow astronauts.
We don't select by blood type. I'm just going to
So what we actually have done in the military is we get a roster of everybody in this room, and we say, okay, everybody who is a type O, low titer, meaning low antibody against A, low antibody against B, everybody who fits that profile gets designated as a donor, a universal donor. And so if there is a need for blood to be transfused, we know who the universal donors are and are not. And we've never had a problem transferring or using type O, low titer whole blood as the first transfusion fluid. Even the AABB is on board with that now for transfusions in the U.S.
We give a lot of O-negative blood.
Yeah.
Flippant counter argument. In a crew of 3, I'd rather select by skill set than blood type.
Yeah, but it's interesting to think about if we do have other medical selection, just because we have no other option, do we put that in the select? Like, you're going to get the people that you want. You're going to have a lot of people with great skill sets. do you begin to look at that sort of stuff?
Have we
I don't
confirmed
know.
that the additional resources and capabilities required for transfusion and maintenance of medical condition that require
Agreed.
the transfusion in the first place are on board? Because if not, it's kind of a wasted effort.
I agree. But again, this is something you need to think about. At some point, the question's going to come up, whether not for en route, but en route just to have on the surface, right? And once you take that equipment once, how long does it last on the surface? I agree. I don't know. But these are things we have to start looking at.
Transfusing whole blood, however you do it, is a logistic challenge, 100%. A good answer to that, which would give you, I'm going to guess, a 2/3 solution, is the freeze-dried plasma that we talked about. And all we have to do is get the manufacturers and the FDA spun up and get serious about supplying that. It's not incredibly important in the U.S. because we can give blood products and EMS systems. But it would be great if the astronauts had freeze-dried blood, and it's being used all over the world except here.
I don't think we have to solve the problem today because the best, these are good topics to talk about and things we need to think about, but the best risk mitigation strategy right now is to prevent these occurrences from even occurring. So how many person years of human spaceflight we have not had, I don't think, anything close to a need for blood transfusion yet. So the best thing to do for now, for the near future, is prevent these from happening by good vehicle design, safety procedures, and all that. I'm not saying we don't need it at some point. I think we do.
It's our only option right now.
Right, but it's something we can still focus on, and it's probably where we should put our energy right now as we're developing these technologies. Especially in the early missions, the engineering risks are probably going to outweigh the medical risks for the short-term missions. So we have time. I guess that's the good news.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to add about major trauma and then punt to Joe, because I think the equation changes when you get to a planetary surface. But until that time, if there's been blunt force trauma sufficient to cause major hemorrhage, I can't imagine that that's happened and you haven't actually lost the hull of your spacecraft and you're dead for a lot of other reasons. Not to say there won't be trauma, broken necks, broken hands, that kind of thing, but I don't know, on planetary surfaces, is that not true anymore?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm looking at two emergency medicine trained people here. Concern for the surface is a crush injury. Or the current design is a very tall rocket and coming off of the elevator and maybe having something really strike you. So there is a risk. And then I'm going to be calling you guys, who are emergency medicine experts, and say, how are we supposed to treat this?
Well, rolling into that, so Dr. Schmidt is actually going to talk about something that everybody knows is coming. It's just going to be really hard to deal with, and that's comm delay.
Well, thanks, Serena. And I was just thinking, talking with Eric before, we have the best job on the planet. We'd all like to get off the planet like Serena and Tom here as flight surgeons. And I was thinking about 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I got a telephone call. I'm like, I don't recognize that number. This must be some warranty or something. I still don't recognize that number. Third time, finally, I picked up the phone, and it was Sandy Magnus on board the space station trying to call me. And she said, Joe, I'm trying to call you. Why don't you pick up? Because I didn't recognize it. So, communications is really important, and we've really enjoyed that. But when we're going back to the moon, it's going to be a delay, 0.8 seconds between here and the moon. And when we go to Mars, it's going to be 8 minutes to 20 minutes, and it's going to extend as we go out that way. So my thesis up front is that the delayed communications between here and between Earth and Moon and Earth and Mars is going to completely change how we do operations. Right now on the space station, when Tom and Serena were there, it's pretty much run from the ground. I mean, every 5 minutes is kind of scheduled, and if you have a big issue during an LOS, you can handle it through the procedures. But for the most part, you guys started calling down and asking for, making sure they're following the right procedures. We're not going to have that. So the crew's going to have to become more and more autonomous. And as Rob Braun pointed out, and a couple other folks I've been working with, Kathy Mosier and Uda Fisher, that's going to be insidious. As we go to Mars, it's going to get slowly farther and farther away. And so that communication delay is going to start to affect. As the Earth gets smaller and smaller, we're not going to be able to overcome that time. So for me, and our group that we're talking through, there's a whole new science in how we're going to be able to communicate, and a whole new set of problems and also opportunities of how to do delayed communications. How can we enhance our communications, and how can we mentor? And for me, it's also, we're going to have complete empathy with that crew on board that vehicle as they go further and deeper into that 8 to 20 minute delay. I was thinking this morning about what are the historical events that have happened because of delayed communication. Go back and look at the Titanic. It hit an iceberg, and there was also a ship that was really nearby. They call it Californian, and they turned off their communications. Had they not turned off their communications, they might have been able to receive the distress signal. Even Gettysburg, fortunately Robert E. Lee lost, unfortunately for the United States, but he was trying to put out orders and he was trying to put out information to his forces, but he was unable to do that. They had delayed communications, he couldn't synchronize, and therefore he lost. Challenger also was a delay of communications and delay of decisions. The engineers in different levels were trying to get their information out and trying to share it with some of the managers, and because of that, they also lost. Katrina, we were here when that happened. Fukushima also was a delayed issue with delayed communications. The Hindenburg, they proceeded into weather, and the weather changed. Had they had the comms and knew that the winds had changed, then maybe they would not have continued. And again, I'll stop after this list, but D-Day also. Hitler, they didn't wake him up. They said you may as well let the guy sleep, right? And because of that, there was a delay in the German forces to respond to that. And also, the Allies took it to their advantage. They put out delayed communications to fake like there was going to be another site. So communications and times are really important. We also have to think, are there advantages for delayed communications? If I don't have to answer really quickly, I might be able to have a nice, thoughtful response. I might be able to think about it rather than immediately responding to the flight director. I might have ability to kind of think through the problem. Also, there's a little reduced risk of pressure to respond. Flexibility also is important when you have delayed communications. If I'm working with Singapore on something, there may be some delay, and we have the ability to talk there. Our schedules may be changed, and our priorities may change as well. I also think there's a tremendous opportunity because you're going to have, coming back from Mars, streams of data are going to be coming in, as well as the voice data. And you're going to have to look at that data as it comes in a delayed fashion, and maybe look in the past, how was that data, was it changing before? So we really have to really think how we're going to be doing things differently. How do I get turned on to this? Well, it was a few years back, and we were communicating with the Aquarius habitat. We were doing an experiment on how to do delayed communication. I was pulled in because of some operational experience, and we simulated a JAXA astronaut who was having to treat another astronaut on this Aquarius habitat who was having chest pain. And there was a delay of a few minutes. And they said, do it, and get the history. It was interesting. I had to really think, how would I package up information and ask questions? And so basically I had to think differently. I had to empathize with that crew medical officer that was there on the Aquarius habitat. And I had to think, okay, how is he going to evaluate this? I had to send him 3 different questions. Is the chest pain associated with cardiac? And I was thinking, is it associated with some sort of a trauma or some sort of a lung issue? And then wait until they sent the information back, and then based on guessing what they were going to send back, send another piece of transmission. And it was really difficult. It was very profound to me how we're going to have to deal with that. We don't know how to deal with it yet, I don't think. I don't think we know how we're going to change our mission objectives. I don't think we know how we're going to change when it comes to that gradually increasing depth. And from the psychosocial isolation too, how are we going to make those connections between us? This bedrock of space medicine, and I'm looking around at the providers here, and folks, John Clark and these other folks that I were standing on their shoulders, it all begins with the trust. Of the trust of the communication that Serena and Tom, if they have an issue on board, that they can call down and ask some of the experts and make that connection. What happens when you're in extreme environments and you're at a deep distance, and how are you going to be able to continue that connection? And there are a couple of Navy SEALs in here as well. I would say that you're, all the things you do with your procedures and your training, but communications probably was one of the more difficult things and the crucial things that you had to maintain. So I submit that we know that we've got bone loss. We know that we've got issues with exercise. We know we've got radiation issues, but I don't think we've really pushed hard enough on this time delay communication. We really have limited experience of it as well. And Rob Branham is in the audience here too. We'll have a chance to talk with him after as well. He's got a really neat system of doing text delayed communications between 2 persons, no matter the distance. So I hope you will talk with him about it as well. So I know I'm trying to stay under 10 minutes, and hopefully we can continue some of the questions after that. But in summary, this delayed communication is really a sneaky problem that's going to come up and get us. And it's also existential on how we're going to have to change our mission. We're going to have this lack of immediacy. You know, we're going to have some things that are problems that we're going to have immediate attention placed to, and you would love to have that real-time data. But how are you going to do that? Are you going to have digital twins of a pilot that's sitting there? Are you going to have a digital twin of a physician that's sitting there and a colleague that's with you? Then there's going to be misinterpretation of those communications. When I send out a question, how was it received? And then when the question was sent back, was it actually the right information that we were trying to get at? So we're going to have to overcome the inability for us to get instant clarification. So I could ask Eric here, what do you mean by that? And we could have the normal conversation. But if there's a 10-minute delay between the two of us, I think we're going to have intensification of that misinterpretation. And then the reduced engagement, like I said before, you know, you're feeling like you're going further and further apart, and the view has not changed much, and that radio connection is going to be even more crucial. How are you going to make that connection and keep that empathy going? How are we going to continue the teamwork that we really enjoyed between ISS and the ground forces? How are we going to continue that on the moon and on the Mars? Are we going to be able to have spontaneous conversations like we do? Just pick up the phone and call your flight doc or call the pilot that worked on something with you. And how are we going to have those dynamic conversations that we really enjoy on Earth? So that's I was trying to go through that very fast. And
Joe, that was fantastic. And as moderator's privilege, I'll take 30 seconds. I think I might have been on that Nemo crew in 2015 where we simulated a 1-minute comm delay, a 3-minute comm delay, and a 5-minute. And I can only tell you the frustration level within the crew builds immediately. And then it turns to anger. And then it turns to, I'm not even going to deal with you. Like that fast. And that we're just going to do our own thing. This is a waste of time. We're not getting anything done. We asked the question. We didn't even get back the answer to the question we thought we were asking. And at some point, very quickly, it goes downhill. I will just tell you that. You don't think about, and you think 1 minute, even 30 seconds. Oh my gosh. So, and that's not dealing, we didn't do that with family. We just did that with operations. So, just to add a little bit of experience, but I remember that very well. So we'll go to our last duo, Dr. Blue and Dr. Marshburn, who are teaming up on this, and this is looking at ACLS kind of expectations for exploration class missions, and even really what we do in LEO right now. Is what we do correct? Is what we do even feasible? Is what we have on ISS right now? Would that even really work if we had an issue? So I'll turn it over to you two.
Just a quick statement. I'll be super short because you basically said what I was going to say, and then which is great. It's not just me asking the question. So I'm in private with a private industry that wants to fly people in space like other industries. We in the medical world look back at our time at NASA with a huge amount of respect. It's incredible what's been accomplished there for medical care for astronauts on the ground and in space, and the entire sphere of health, what is done for humans that fly in space. And there are some cases that we ask ourselves, we know what we could do because we could try to match what NASA does, but should we do it? And I'll just make a statement, and that is when we talk about medical devices, medical capabilities, we have to, especially those who are coming up to develop these future capabilities, we have to ask, how does it fit in the entire chain of medical care? This especially applies to low Earth orbit because there's an implication that you can get somebody home to a definitive medical care facility. So I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe our current ALS, let's say, capability on the ISS is somewhat ad hoc. Here's an AED. That's wonderful. It's small, it's compact, it's automatic. Anybody can use it. Grandma can use it. Put it up in space. Now what are you going to do? Oh, we're going to have to start IVs. All right, who's going to start them? We have to train that. We need medical O2. Okay, what does that imply? What if someone's breathing problem gets worse? Well, we can intubate because we have all kinds of techniques to intubate. And so the concern is building a chain that's actually not realistic, that cannot be achieved. And is it the right thing to do to throw everything at a problem with the hopes of it being good? What are the optics afterwards to say, you knew probably this wasn't going to work. Why did you even advertise you could? So that's kind of a harsh way of saying it. By the way, it's not just the medical world. You probably remember with the shuttle, the return to launch site capability, there's that black zone in the ascent of when the shuttle launches, which is, we don't think you're going to make it back if you have complete engine failure. But yeah, we could like drop the external tank and do this high yucca and go screaming back, flop over your top and just come in. And we would train that more than anything else to get ready for a space flight. After every sim, the commanders turn around, looking at us in the flight deck and going, this ain't going to work. But it was an engineering solution to really an unsolvable problem. So that's all I'm going to say, and turn it over to Dr. Blue. Hot potato.
So what I love about this conference in particular and the panels when I'm invited to sit on them is I come thinking I know what I'm going to say, and then over the course of sitting at this end of the table, I'm like, wait. I have other words I'm going to say now. So I have other words I'm going to say. So I have the fortunate seat on this panel of being able to put words in all of your mouths and summarize what you guys have said, and continue to address this question of, yes, ALS on orbit, but the broader picture of what do we fly and why do we fly it, right? And I think that's a lot of what we're discussing at this conference in general, in this community in general. And some of what I've heard, said on this panel is, looking back to Dr. Butler, right? We've got this question of, know the indications. Don't put a tourniquet on something that's not bleeding, right? Know the indications and then reassess those indications as you go forward. That can be applied to the entirety of this field, right? How do we know what those indications are? Well, we model it. We look at the old data. But to do that, we need to start by looking at the data. We need to aggregate the data. And what we've heard earlier today is from a whole panelist of individuals who have this wealth of knowledge of things that happened on Skylab. And I don't know about the rest of the crowd, but I learned things today, right? So the fact is, we have so much information about the vast experience of human spaceflight that has yet to be aggregated and analyzed and pumped into Dr. Kurtzman's model to help us predict what we really need to worry about. Let's talk about that model, right? One of your first statements, let me put words in your mouth, is medical is going to be the biggest risk. But probabilistic risk assessment has modeled an expectation that there will be a significant medical event once out of every 3.2 years on ISS, and that an evacuation should be expected once every 5 to 15 years. How many years have we been up there? We have never once had to evacuate somebody from ISS. Knock on some wood, that's wonderful, but probabilistic risk assessment, modeling prediction based on even historical data that we do have, is not perfect. So among the additional discussion of predicting and assessing and reassessing and trying to figure out how we can address medical risk, what that medical risk is, we also need to talk about futility, right? And when we talk about advanced medical capabilities, one thing we need to recognize is that while we have exceptional astronauts, we know that. We have exceptional medical astronauts. We are sitting up here with a couple of them, right? They are exceptional. They have clinical experience. They have clinical background. They are doctors. But when they go to space, they're astronauts. And it's been a while since they were that other thing, right? And as much as we can say we can train them to do ultrasound-guided procedural interventions, and as much as we have had success of getting the image window that we're looking for, while all these things have been successful, it's also worth noting that every single time we train a crew to do something like this, we're taking time away from training them how to do something else, like fix that water system that provides them the entirety of their drinking water, right? And so every time we make that decision of what do we fly, we have to lean back and look again at what am I giving up to get it there. One of the things that I know out there in the crowd, there's gonna be somebody who watched the YouTube video. I've watched the YouTube video. How many of you guys have heard that 100 Tampons song? How many of you have heard it? How many have heard it, right? There's this lovely story and a song that goes with it of the fact that when Sally Ride first went to space, they offered her 100 tampons for a 6-day flight. And they said, is that going to be enough? That joke goes around and we all laugh about it. And if you haven't watched the video, watch it. It's a funny song. But Do you guys know what the current standard is? If you don't, let me tell you. 16.2 sanitary napkins per crew member per day in a 6-day cycle per month. Give that math a minute. Current standard is 100 tampons. So let's calculate that out. You want to spend a year on the moon? That's 8.1 kilos. Do you guys know what a medical kit weighs? If you guys got one in the trunk, go lift it. I mean, depends on what you pack, but rough estimates, 2 to 6 kilo, roughly speaking. I'm packing more tampons than medications, right? This, to be blunt, this is why we can't have nice things. But when we make these calculations, when we decide to fly ACLS, we need to not just look at things like when was the last time that physician astronaut ran a code. And also, speaking as one of the handful that you've had on this stage who do work clinically and actively do see codes, how many people are in that room, right? I'm a dumb ED doc, right? I just stand at the head of the bed and bark out orders. Once the tube's in place, all I do is say, is it time for epi? It's time for epi, right? There are 14 people in that room with me that are pushing those drugs and drawing them up and mixing them and keeping time and keeping documentation, right? Those people, that doesn't even account for the people who change the diaper on the guy 3 days later, right? We don't have that. Right? And we have to think what comes next. It's not just how do you do CPR in space, right? It's not just do I have epi. It's the 4 days of pressors that guy is going to need and the IV pump that follows, right? It's not just packing the quick clot. It's what got the bullet through it, right? And how well is that going to work in the absence of an operational suite? Okay, not in space, hopefully. But when somebody falls off of the ginormous rocket on the surface and lands and gets that crush injury, what can we actually do to keep that person alive all the way to ground becomes very limited. And it's not about skill set. Well, this is not me advocating for a physician on every flight. This is me saying you need to match your capability to your expectations. And in a lot of cases, we need to adjust those expectations, right? We can figure out how to freeze dry and fly a whole bunch of blood. We can. But is that the right use of resources? Is it the right use of resources to pack 8.1 kilos of tampons? I would argue that maybe needs some reassessment.
All right. So we are going to open it up to questions from the audience. And Dr. Lenhart.
Okay, I'm just going to make a comment, and this is going to give away my age. But I was the astronaut office representative to the crew equipment board when Sally flew, and I don't think there were 100 tampons on there. I will tell you that our biggest challenge, and actually it was, I think, a victory of sorts, was that Sally, being the first female to fly, was making sure that all of the equipment in the waste management system was appropriate. I think you were talking about that too. So they had actually flown the waste management system on the KC-135, which is a platform we still sorely need. And they actually had a toilet in there, and they had subjects that did that. And based on that, on the outcome of some of that, Judy Resnick and I actually redesigned the interface between the women's anatomy and the males, or the system, and then the guys liked it so well they chose it and put it in the WCS system. But you know, we overcame that. That was just introduction of new equipment. But I think that in the work that I'm doing, we need to start really looking also at the fact that we're in partial gravity environments, 2 different partial gravity environments. And that may not sound so important now, but when you're dealing with fluid systems and you've got the potential of generating bubbles, and some of my work shows that a bubble at 0G is going to be real similar to a bubble at 1.6G in terms of being entrapped into your infusion systems and so forth. We need to be looking at this whole systems on medical capability with that as an environmental factor as well, not just temperature. But I think that we talked about systems in terms of medicine. I think it's really important. The human systems integration to the engineering part of it will be an important thing. So thank you for allowing me to say that.
No, absolutely.
No, I think it's actually a really incredibly important point, and we talk about that, and I'm so glad you brought up waste management, and you had brought it up earlier, Dr. Aunon Chancellor, as well, because the design of that, goes back to exactly what we're talking about, right? And that it's just a wonderful example. We talk about needing to fly sufficient medical equipment to manage concerns, and one of the concerns that's brought up frequently is urinary infections, right? But again, if you start looking about prioritization of where you put your resources, appropriate design of waste management systems that collect urine in male versus female anatomy goes a long way to the prevention of medical risk like infection. And so even just looking at that engineering and human systems interface is a hugely valuable place to put your resources long before we put them into enormous medical kit design.
If I can share, Dr. Dunbar, you were talking about having that and doing zero gravity. We really need to do more work with that. I've taken care of a number of ladies on board the station, and the way that the station toilet was for the longest time, the males, the anatomy is such that you can use a vacuum, but the females, you have to apply something that actually comes closer to their anatomy. The issue with the previous design was you had to have that, and the angle was impossible to urinate and defecate at the same time. Some of my earlier females had told me they actually had to separate it because the way that adapter was, it wouldn't fit right against the toilet itself. So you really have to test it and do it under zero gravity to make sure that it actually functions well. I don't know, many males can't do it. I don't know how the ladies would be able to separate those two things out.
Oh, we've got two questions. Yep. We'll go Bill Shepard, and then we've got Dr. Lenhart back here.
So you touched a real hot button because we used the Russian toilet on ISS, obviously. And in the ISS program, there were many millions of dollars spent on developing a better toilet based on the shuttle model. The Russian system was quite agricultural, but it was extremely robust. You could not break that thing. There were no computers on it. And if you needed to repair it, you could field strip it, take it apart, put the new parts in a reasonably sanitary manner, get it back online in about an hour. And that is one of the issues that I don't think the U.S. space program yet has learned, that complexity can be your enemy. And something that's simple and robust, we have got to design our hardware that way.
Dr. Lenhart.
So, Dr. Schmidt, I appreciate you bringing up the comm delays, and I agree with you completely. We have a vehicle up there right now and lots of other ground assets that we could use to start testing new strategies for addressing comm delays, and ultimately we have to start becoming progressively Earth independent in our operations, and we could start today. We choose not to because we really like the real-time comm, but I think the question that I have, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on this, even if we develop strategies for comm delay, there's one comm delay that we, at least right now, don't think we can overcome, which is solar conjunction. And so at some point on a Mars mission, the sun will be between the Earth and the spacecraft, and there might be 2 weeks during which you cannot speak to the spacecraft in any way, shape, or form. And that's a comm delay that I don't think we have any technology right now that can address.
Dr. Lenhart, you're exactly right. And the issue is, how do you prepare for that? It's coming. You got this season of comm delay, and like you said, 2 weeks, right? And how do you prepare for that? You got to simulate it, and maybe you already start to see where you're having equipment that's going to fail, or maybe you got a medical issue that you're heading into that. So I completely agree with you, and you can't come back. So you're going to have, as you guys have been working at XMC, you have to have much more autonomy, maybe a digital copy of physicians and people who can telementor and see all the data that's coming before, examine it, and then be ready when they come out of that comm, or come up with the solar intranet. We're going to have to push to have other craft be able to relay information somehow. But you're right, we're going to have to test it. I think we're going to discover opportunities as well. Hopefully it sounds positive that this is going to help us, because we do comm delay all the time right now. We have email that sits for a while. We have time zones that sit for a while, and we've got people that we need to work together. So this may be a really good spin-off as to how to figure out how to do things. We have submarines that go under for a period of time, and how do we how do we do that too? So that's a whole realm that XMC can help us out with.
Yeah, I didn't have time to talk about it, but I was going to talk about Earth-independent medical operations that I know XMC Element is addressing already. So it's in the works, right? Right, Chris?
Right, Chris.
Yeah.
Way to toss that one. Good.
Yeah, you guys answered. You answered my question, but I would throw out there, by the time we really get to Mars, we're going to have a 3D Joe Schmidt up there. You know, you're working on the holoportation stuff. You might comment on that, but I think you'll have an AI program, medically speaking, maybe not telling you what to do with the spacecraft, but maybe that's you in 3D form, maybe even tactile. You think?
I think, thank you, Dr. Johnson. We are trying to do this thing called holoportation, where we scan a 3D image of a person and then put it at distance. And we did that with station. We were the first humans to be holoported to the space station. So there was a guy who was wearing, Thomas Pesquet was wearing a HoloLens, and he was able to see us floating in front of him in the ISS. And then we did a two-way, actually. The same team worked with Mark Pathy and the AX-1 it was. And I tell you guys, I was wearing the HoloLens, and folks in MCC were, and Mark Pathy was floating in front of me with, I could see the space station racks behind him, and I felt like I was looking into a science fiction connection, you know. And so, how are you going to do that? I really think, as you said, Smith, we're going to have copies of us in those other locations. And for me, it's a new way to explore as well. You can actually put yourself, and then to use haptics, as well as to see data that's coming in and interact with that data. It's going to be fun.
Dr. Van Balen.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of pick on this independent operations and maybe channel Becky's view or attitude just a little bit. But I'm warning you up front, okay? Just being fair, okay? But in the last year, the agency has looked at capabilities that are needed, especially for certain lunar missions, and then certainly for Mars. And independent operations is one of those. And I understand this is a space medicine summit, but I also think we can't, and Chris and I have had these conversations a bunch, we're talking about medical operations being independent, but the reality is all operations on the vehicle have to be independent, and our operations to date have really heavily, for all vehicle systems, really heavily relied on the ground. And so that plan for where medical fits into those independent operations is totally fascinating to me, because how do all those systems come together and we design a whole new way of doing missions? So I just think it's a fascinating idea going forward, and I think I'm trying to put some realism. There's some challenges in all of that as well.
We got Dr. Warren and then Dr. Shepard.
I've got a point of order on that comment. The initial plan for the first expedition was the crew was going to have long periods of loss of comm because of the way the orbit was constructed and the absence of a complete satellite relay. So everything that we did as far as the management and operations of the station, the relationship with the crew and the ground was predicated on the crew being able to act independently when they had to. And for whatever reason, we have erased most of that capability today, which I think is a big mistake.
That's interesting. I agree. Dr. Warren.
I would.
Oh, go ahead, Becky.
Hold that. I would also pile on to that by saying that the ability to maintain independence in management of your vehicle relies upon a skill set on board that vehicle. And to ensure that that skill set is on board the vehicle, you may need to compromise on other skill sets on board vehicles, like advanced medical capabilities on board vehicles. And there's a bit of a balance there, right? And so if you, just like we're talking about, if you fly a ventilator, you may be giving up another piece of equipment. The brains that you fly are also in that trade space, right? And so the ability to fly someone like yourself, sir, who can independently manage a vehicle in orbit, it takes a skill set, right? And that skill set must be protected as a resource on board, potentially at the risk of losing alternative resources on board.
One of my cosmonaut buddies during our training in Russia, which was quite arduous and somewhat foreign to the way we train in the U.S., said, "Shep, down here we have to do what the instructors say, but once we're in orbit, you are in charge."
It worked out.
My comment is a little bit of a a teaser for some of the content of tomorrow, I believe, which is autonomous capabilities in the vehicles themselves. There's research happening right now, quite advanced research, in enabling the habitat, like a smart habitat that is able to self-diagnose, self-schedule, not necessarily do all the repairs itself, but interact with the humans in a way that helps behavioral health, physiological health, and vehicle health, all in an integrated system. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that are happening right now in research, and I think bodes very well for the future.
I also want to throw this out. We were talking earlier about numbers, and I deeply respect Dr. Kurtzman's model and numbers and things. December 14th, the Soyuz took a hit where we lost all our coolant. And 1 month later, I think it was, the Progress also lost coolant. And so the people were thinking, is that some sort of a sharpshooter micrometeor that hit us? That can't be right. And they looked at the numbers, and they said it was probably a 1 in 10,000 chance, or maybe a 1 in a million chance that you would have those things happen. Well, it turns out, actually, the statisticians got back together, and they said just because of the angle of where the Soyuz is hanging out with the service module at the bottom and kind of unprotected, and the way the Progress as well, it was actually they redid the numbers, and it's 1 in 1.25 of a micrometeor hitting that area over the lifetime on the station. So it was actually meant to happen. So at least the statisticians are telling us now. So we have to think about these 1% rules, and rolling the dice of Vegas, but the numbers may change. So,
Yeah, I would say the numbers don't lie, but they change, right? So with when they first had the first shuttle missions, the risk assessment was super low, but as we saw the Challenger accident in Columbia, they redid the probabilistic risk assessment. They were much higher when you go back retrospectively and look at the numbers. So you have to be careful how you use those techniques, but they can be valuable.
Absolutely, and that, again, because otherwise, if you don't have the numbers and what Dr. Kurtzman's doing, you'll have 15 doctors arguing, and we'll have 20, 30 opinions.
So we'll give you the numbers, and then you can argue after you see the numbers.
So I think we're almost out of time, but would any of the other panelists like to make any closing comments, final thoughts, anything you didn't get in? Go backs, I forgot. Any final questions from the audience?
I'll just put in a quick pitch for working at NASA means high-tech, cutting edge. It's wonderful, but don't forget the basics. Robust hardware, sometimes simple is best. Sometimes it was just a procedure that was needed that wasn't very well written that could have made the difference. So that is to say, there are solutions out there, and let's not forget the ones, the basics that we may have forgotten on the way.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for this panel. It was all that I had hoped it would be. Thank you for attending. Don't forget, we are going to have this tomorrow. It won't run quite as long in the day for a variety of reasons. I want to mention also, though, I appreciate so much the panelists like Dr. Butler and many of the others that supported Smith's presentation, that the pay for the speakers and the panelists is not very good. And we really appreciate them coming and interacting with us and teaching us and helping human spaceflight. And I would appreciate if you'd give all of our speakers today in this panel a round of applause.